Okay, start. All right. So let me first and foremost thank Raphael for organizing this and for a series of talks where I certainly have learned a great deal. I'm sorry Pascal had to miss yesterday, and it would have been interesting to hear how he and John would have interacted on the question of the experiments, but I'll come back to that. Secondly, let me mention that the title is Raphael's, and it led me into an odd situation. I rarely reread my own work. Once I published it, I'm always moving on to some other project, and then I had to reread my own paper and try and think, what in the world was I doing here? What did I think I was doing? And what struck me is that what motivated the article, what the philosophical purposes I had in mind, my own views, now developed views on historical explanation, were not at that point developed. But what was on my mind as I was thinking about these issues was, can a non-realist and a naturalist view, such as the one I hold, provide normative guidance, specifically with the question to what makes explanations better or worse? And so in this sense, I'm mostly on the same page with someone like Pascal Ludwig. I came at it thinking about it as a philosopher of social science / philosopher of science. That is, how do you evaluate explanations for better or worse? And a secondary question I had in mind is, and one that's come up repeatedly in the discussions here, is, what explains events like the Holocaust? What counts as an explanation, right? I think Raphael's talk, made this very, very graphic. What are we going to count as an acceptable explanation for this sort of event? And the article was my attempt to respond to both of these questions. But in retrospect, I have to say that unwittingly, what I wound up producing was a kind of philosophical anthropology. And so towards the end of the talk, I'm going to go all John Doris on this and offer a type of provocation to the group about how I now read my own work, and what questions, if I were redoing this today, where I would put emphasis that's not so pronounced in the 2004 article. A further issue that was on my mind was to downplay, or if not discard, but at least minimize any distinction between explanation and understanding, which, right, in the context of philosophy of science, at least as I was raised in it, right, is typically taken as a contrast between causal and intentional explanations, right, and that the two are thought to be, right, and this goes back to the 19th century debate, in tension, where intentional explanations pull towards the particular, causal explanations pull towards the general, never the twain shall meet. So in responding to questions 1 regarding the normativity, I chose to focus on the Browning-Goldhagen debate. This wasn't an accident either, because since I had a historical explanation on my mind, and the Holocaust is always a topic that comes up when talking about especially non-realist views of history, such as I hold, so you don't believe the Holocaust happened, people, it's the first question you get. And I had been very impressed by sort of the type of mugging to which Hayden White had been subjected, which is canonized in the volume Probing the Limits of Representations, very similar to the way Kuhn was mugged by the Popperians in Criticism in the Growth of Knowledge. Everyone piling on. So I thought it important to address the Holocaust specifically because it's such a flashpoint of debate, and there simply is no consensus about how to explain perpetrator behavior. And the Brownian-Goldhagen debate from a philosophy of science standpoint, philosophy of social science standpoint, sort of tailor-made, right? They're working off exactly the same archival evidence, right? There's no substantive disagreement of facts between the two of them. And they come to pretty much diametrically opposed positions. So it seems like a textbook case of underdetermination at the very least. But underdetermination doesn't address the normative question, namely, okay, so you have two theories, two accounts that seem tied on the basis of evidence. Can normatively you give a reason for preferring one explanation to the other? And that was sort of the mindset I had going into the material. To try and say why I thought Browning had a better explanation than Goldhagen, without saying that, right, there's, trying at the same time trying to acknowledge ambiguities in the evidence and the fact that they seem to take the same set of facts into account. Now, as I hinted in the question that I addressed to Pascal, the various ways in which the Milgram experiment has come under pressure, I actually don't see as negatively impacting the use I made of it. Whether or not, I'll come back to this. The point is that the Milgram experiment has been replicated. That is, the effect's been replicated. And to me, that's the relevant point. Whether the agentic hypothesis is correct or not, I really don't care. What seems to me interesting and important is the fact that you can construct situations, and I'll have things to say apropos Isabel's concern about whether no entity without identity, a phrase near and dear to my heart, whether somehow I'm violating, I'm littering the furniture of the universe with a notion of situation that isn't appropriate. As I wrote in the 2004 paper, reference to norms here represents only speculation. For what these experiments indicate is that the vast majority of people will, in fact, abdicate. And I had it in quotes, right? I just, what was the psychological state? I don't know. And in fact, it doesn't, as I said, the philosophical psychology doesn't much interest me. What interests me is replicability. The experiments, as I wrote then, in and of themselves determine no answers to the question of why. Right now, Dan in chat raised the question of, well, if, how is it generalizable? The point is, I'll come back to this, and Dan, I'm sure will have things to say, but in the paper, what I talk about is what I call release conditions. Now, I don't know where I got that phrase, actually. I have in mind that I picked it up in the literature. I don't know if I coined it, but I'm going to use it. And it seems to me that situational accounts are not causal in the sense of supplying necessary or sufficient conditions for behavior. I would say now that the proper analogy would be to think of them along the lines of rational choice theory, right? that they provide a type of model of behavior. That is to say, say in behavioral economics, for example, you get a fascinating number of games which you can correct for social and cultural factors. But the point here is that these allow you to reproduce certain effects, right? And you can reproduce these on a sort of, so to speak, a macro level in complete ignorance, with no need of knowing about individual motivations, right? You just know if you stage things in a certain way, more often than not, you get a certain outcome, right? So take a very behavioral approach to this, right? And just black box the motivational question. So in any case, I read the results of these experiments, provide a way to estimate for a population what sort of behavioral profile will on average emerge. A model is not a causal account, and it offers neither insight nor exculpation regarding motives and the like, right? It does not preclude thick description, it just serves a different purpose. As I said in the 2004 paper, I wrote, for my purposes, the question, here I was addressing issues raised by the historian Bruno Bauer, takes as constituting the real unsolved mystery, that is conformity or consensus, is precisely the one for which social psychologists provide an answer. If we insist on posing the question as motivational, then there appears only to be a forced choice between seeing a tyranny of culture or a tyranny of circumstance as swaying people to act. But I wrote, suppose we assume that the dissonance exists only from the perspective of selected observers. That is, any need to provide a motivational explanation simply assumes the existence of that which the motivation then purports to account for, namely the special need to link the treatment of individuals received to some prior set of beliefs on the part of perpetrators. But it is precisely this assumption, at least on my reading of the social psychological experiments, that are called into question. One need not posit any reason. One need not posit any reason to explain the compliance of behavior of the perpetrators. Rather, it suffices to say that this is just what people do when placed in certain sorts of circumstances. And this is also how I read the Ash paradigm. People simply comply. I don't want to quibble, I mean, with Pascal's reading, but he said, well, you got 30% conformity, right? But I think Ash, as I recall, Ash also says if you iterate the experiment, it typically goes to 50%. That is, on iterated trials, about half the people will go with the shorter line. And I would still argue, Pascal's impressed by 70% nonconformity. I'm much more impressed by 30% conformity. That seems to me stunning, and what we really have to keep in view. And in this regard, I'll thank John Doris for his very thorough, balanced, and interesting review of the critical literature. I've not really followed the literature around Milgram and Zapata in anywhere near the detail and depth that John did. Though the most recent overviews I could find by Alette Schmulers and of course Nessa Russell's 2-volume work led me to the general conclusions that Doris endorsed. And this is somewhat at odds with I haven't gone into the details in the way that Pascal did or that John did about the validity, but for example, Alette Schmulers, in a piece published in 2020 in the Journal of Perpetrator Research, writes, quoting now, Milgram rightly concluded that people were not intrinsically sadistic, but that, quoting from Milgram, something far more dangerous was revealed: the capacity for man to abandon his humanity, indeed the inevitability that he does so as he merges his unique personality into larger constitutional structures, close quote. I'm sorry, Schmulitz goes on, this was an important finding. And she notes that this does not depend on Milgram's own views about agentic state. Even after the data is reanalyzed, and she also looked at the Perry work, and so we discussed this a bit yesterday, it's something like 40% of the people still go to maximum voltage. And, these after the fact rationales, Karsten quoted, the famous line from that Browning quotes, people who were interviewed from the battalion after the war, where there is no threat of prosecution and so forth, and the rationales they give are just jaw dropping. You don't know what these people are. I don't know what these people are really thinking, and inclined to wonder about, once people have been debriefed about the Milgram experiments, how they're going to try and explain their own behavior. I'm quite willing to grant everything Pascal said about construct validity, but that's not, as I said, the particular psychological hypothesis that Milgram was working with is not, I think, the critical factor. Nestor Russell, in his work, says that numerous independent replications and variations conducted in different nations at different times and different types of victims all suggest, Russell writes, all suggests that the obedience research program was in all likelihood internally valid. So what I take from this, and what I took myself to be arguing in the paper, was that the situational account shows that the problem of understanding is actually quite shallow, by which I meant that there's no need to assess what's going on in someone's mind or to try and imagine their beliefs. Rather, this is just how people behave when circumstances by design or accident place them in particular situations. And here, right, you can think also of work, say, by people like Irving Goffman, who have looked at the ways in which just structuring certain environments, either physically, bureaucratically, mental institutions, jails, and so forth, leads to predictable to known patterns of behavior. And again, I have to say, just to put my own political biases on the table here, that events like January 6th in the United States, what we currently see going on, what happened in Abu Ghraib, these are like natural experiments that provide further evidence for the powerful trigger that release factors have on behavior. As an aside, I'll also mention that I sent Dan Little a note to chat asking him why he saw a tension between his situational account and his historicism one, since, as I wrote to Dan, I think historicism as situationalism writ large. In fact, I wanted to take the opportunity to provoke Dan a little further. In fact, I'm worried that the person on the screen is just a poseur, because the Dan Little I know, is a fan of rational choice theory, and would have talked about reforming things in terms of restructuring, say, choice options for rational individuals, rather than the type of hopeful re-education program that I heard Dan advocating for yesterday. Finally, I cannot share Dan's implicit optimism, as I heard him, that educational reform actually holds any hope here. One reaction in Germany post-war was an attempt at major reforms of its educational system, precisely to try and, the Germans have quite agonized over this period. They much more so than, unfortunately, Americans agonize over racism and its heritage for us. And Habermas famously praises Goldhagen because the way he reads Goldhagen, the way he presents it, is what Goldhagen really shows is the need for educational reform to reorient the focus of German education. And probably, as all of you know, right, it's very common in Europe to take high school students to the death camps, right, as part of the education. I mean, I was quite shocked when I visited Auschwitz by the number of tour buses with teenagers that were there. But I am not aware, actually, of any data, and it is an empirical question of how effective this has been. Has it impacted or changed people's attitudes? A lot of assumptions being made about clearly what will help to re-educate people. I don't know what data there actually is that shows the effectiveness of any of this, and the current political situation makes one skeptical. So yeah, I don't think you have to view people as cultural dopes, in Garfinkel's phrase. All you have to do is know that, right, if you stage situations in certain ways, and this is low-level empiricism, you can get certain effects. And that's all that's needed. Now, I chose the epigraph from Arendt because, as far as I know, she wrote it in ignorance of Milgram's work, though of course not in ignorance of Hilberg's. And what Arendt says in Eichmann in Jerusalem, that at least that I quote her as saying, is that politically speaking, is that under conditions of terror, most people will comply, but some people will not. Just as the lesson of the countries into which the final solution was proposed is that it could happen in most places, but it did not happen everywhere. And I think it again somewhat misses the point to nitpick about Milgram or Zimbardo. What we know empirically is that tens of thousands of people cooperated or were directly involved in one way or another in the extermination process, right? And if you want to say, well, how do you generate such a population? Well, 30%, 40% of the people gives you enough bodies. In addition, right, we have evidence such as the Klemperer diaries that strike me anyway, as giving powerful testimony to the way in which people's behavior, your colleagues, your neighbors, will turn on a dime, right? Take over your job, take over your house, right? People who were the week before your neighbors. And there was also the famous controversy between Martin Brozat and Saul Friedlander, right? No one ever accused Brozat, a respected German historian, post-war historian, who did a project studying how the Second World War impacted people living in towns and villages that were fairly far removed from any of the activity. And he found that life just went on, and Saul Friedlander bitterly, and no one ever accused Brozat of anti-Semitism, including Friedlander, but Friedlander's point was, what are you calling normal here? Your neighbors are disappearing, and life just goes on, right? No one's raising an eyebrow. It seems to me that the collective evidence, people are sort of wringing their hands saying, what's the motivation? What I don't know. The people seem unfazed. No one, somewhat to my surprise, has sort of mentioned Samantha Power's, I think, very powerful book, A Problem from Hell, 2002, right, where she just looks at genocides in the 20th century, right, and how very quickly populations are mobilized to turn on each other. And I'd like to actually hear more from Isabel, since she's actually studied this on the ground, but right, at least one has the impression that people can live as neighbors one day and be killing each other the next. And this was part of what interested me, whether you needed a Goldhagen type long-term account of motivational structure, or if it was much easier than we imagined to get these changes in behavior. And I became quite convinced, based on my own reading of the literature, that it's frighteningly easy to get people to pivot behaviorally in very dramatic ways. So the divide between explanation and understanding presupposes certain defaults, I would say, about human behavior. I think that these assumptions about moral precepts normally guiding behavior are in fact naive, and they misdirect attention to what needs accounting for. A good part of what I find attractive about situational models just is the fact that they suggest that the stability of behavior is often a function of the environment and not of beliefs. Beliefs may rationalize behavior, but I myself am skeptical that beliefs are typically the primary determinant. Right now, Isabel mentioned in her talk the other day, right, that some of the people she avoided interviewing, understandably, or had histories of violent behavior. But if you look at some of the work that's been done on the post-war Germany, you get a very different profile. That is, many of the people who were involved in the extermination operation had no prior history, no prior criminal history, and rather interestingly, post-war disappeared just back into the regular population. Right, DeMilt's book addresses this in detail. He follows up on a lot of the people who were known to have been concentration camp guards involved in various ways, and there's no subsequent criminal history to be reported, and no prior history that's noted. there's also, studies that have been done in what's called the T4 program, which was, the sort of the dry run for the, it's now viewed as dry run for the Holocaust, killing people with various mental and physical impairments, almost all of them Aryan, right, not Jews. Again, it was not difficult to recruit people to do this. Henry Friedlander, the leading historian of this, says, after having done a close study of the work, he has no idea of how to explain people's behavior who participate in the program. So if I was doing this all today, I would actually focus more on work by particularly Zimbardo, where he talks about de-individuation. This was done prior to the Stanford experiment. And de-individuation concerns not only the victims, but the perpetrators. That is, what people will do or are willing to do when they think they're not being observed or watched, and how they're willing to behave in groups when they think that somehow responsibility is not going to be traced back to them. And I would now emphasize more than I did the question of how much does it take to change people's behavior, or what accounts for stability of relationships. And I think this is a critical and under-addressed question. I think a lot of the hand-wringing about explaining the Holocaust is on the assumption that the defaults we observe are actually binding on us, and that the sort of perpetrator behavior that's been recorded not just in the Holocaust, but going forward in the 20th century, particularly since we can document it rather well, is extraordinary. I'm myself skeptical. I think stability is what requires the explanation, not this other behavior. Or at least I want to pose that as a hypothesis, that we ought to more worry than we do about what keeps us in bounds, and maybe view perpetrator behavior as, if not a norm, at least what people are perfectly capable of doing when certain release conditions are present. And in this regard, so just to end on a specifically philosophical note, right, Thomas Nagel in his version of the moral luck paper talks about whether we take a first person or a third person perspective on our own behavior. And this, of course, what Raphael was emphasized. I took one of his points of emphasis to be that the more we take a first person perspective, we're inclined to think of it as intentional, as belief directed, agential, all that good stuff. But the more we take a third person perspective on our behavior, we see it as subjective and contingent on factors that are not in our control. And I guess, like Browning, I'm inclined to think that if the failure to do bad things is as much a result of moral luck as it is of having the right beliefs or good education. So on that cheery note, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you. So this was very interesting. And I may ask the first question because so just so there is something that was really puzzling me when I was translating your paper. So and you made this claim again that this is how people behave in such situations. And so then you follow Browning, who raises the question, was Joseph Hoff a kind of open air Milgram experiment? And he says yes. So I think you agree. And actually I am convinced by what you say, and also by what Browning said that we can say that there is an identity or kind of identity, but without identity conditions between these two situations. But then I don't follow you is when you draw from this that there is no need for an explanation. And it really puzzles me because for me, even if in the Milgram experiment we need, I think it was what Pascal was talking about, even if we're in the Milgram situation, we still need an explanation to explain why in this situation people behave like this. So I have the impression that we don't work with the same idea of what is an explanation. I have the impression that you work with a counterfactual conception of explanation. So if there was not this situation, they would not have acted in the same way. So then it explains, and that's enough. And I think that I work with a processual idea of explanation. So even if you have the counterfactual events, you still need to explain how the process that goes between these events and the gesture. And then there is things in the mind, what is perceived, how the interpretation is perceived, how the beliefs are activated, how the memories are activated, how the deliberation is produced. Is it a technical deliberation? Is it a moral deliberation? And so I think that there is, even if we accept your point, and which I accept, and I think it asks for an explanation, and we need to make lots of work to understand what's going on in the head of the people between the situation and the gesture. So yeah, that was my kind of it's a question that I have for 3 years.
There's been discussion, right, of the cover photo, which I have to say was the product of and I'm perfectly accepting of it, but I didn't choose the cover photo. The publisher and Raphael did that. But the Goldhagen photo that's always been sort of burned into my mind, it was the one of the Nazi soldier, I think it was taken in Russia, where staying with a rifle to the head of it's presumably a mother holding a young child, right? And you know what their fate was going to be. And when I've taught, I taught, of course, on Holocaust historiography a number of times. I like to remind students that opening line of Bob Dylan's song, Queen Jada approximately, they're selling postcards of the hanging. And, it's a literal reference to an event, not a unique event, of a lynching that took place in Minnesota, where Dylan was from. And yeah, and there was a whole Smithsonian exhibit on this of postcards of people, of photos based on people at lynchings, right? And so these Browning photos are, as horrific as they are, right, are far from unique, right? And okay, what do you say to this? I mean, I just gestured towards this. I personally don't know what would count as an explanation of this sort of behavior. It just, my lack of imagination, I guess. But you simply have, as a matter of fact, right, not just the Germans, right, Samantha Power document, the Cambodians, the Khmer Rouge kept incredible graphic evidence of tortures and everything else. I don't know. I guess I'm not directly addressing your question, Raphael. I just don't know how. I don't know how getting what it means to get inside someone's head for these sorts of situations.
Okay, so I have the impression that your response is skeptical. That actually you said that we cannot find the explanation. What we know is that the situation brings about this kind of behavior, but we cannot say more.
This is what makes, it seems to me, this is what makes someone like Trump so dangerous. Trump is who he is, but he sets up release conditions, and now racism. You look at the number of people. Right. What impresses me more than Trump is the number of people who were, attracted to him, right, who were willing to work with him, right, highly educated people, products of our best institutions. That to me is what keeps me up at night. There'll always be the Donald Trumps of this world. Mm. It's how people, he creates an atmosphere, right? And you get enough people who respond to that it endangers everyone.
I think, Carsten, you have a question and you need to go soon.
Yes, thanks, Paul. That was great. I think I agree with you that Milgram's experiments in some sense apply to the Holocaust, but I mean, in some sense, I think we can't forget about what goes on in the black box that brings it about. But it seems to me what Pascal was suggesting, that it may be trust versus obedience. I mean, it seems to go together insofar as science is concerned, right? We won't blindly follow orders if they completely violate everything that we hold dear. But insofar as the science is concerned, we trust we obey because we trust ultimately the scientist having the authority. And I think, so one probably shouldn't take Milgram as showing that whatever the guy with authority says will be followed. But I think one could argue that in the context of trusting something what he is saying, then we probably will follow. And here I think I mean the focus on what has gone on, the ideological framework, even though these people were not committed Nazis, at least they were, I think familiar with the idea that there is a Jewish problem. That seems to be something that I think Welser particularly emphasizes in his book. So you might say that these Nazis at least were trusted in somehow addressing that problem, as strange and morally abhorrent as it sounds. So I do think one, regardless of how one fully thinks about the nitty-gritty of the underlying psychological mechanisms, there seems to be something very similar, right? That actually then also says something about the outlook of the people who follow these orders, right? So I don't think that just because Trump says these things, he's followed. But there's something psychologically going on that he appeals to the resentment that a lot of people feel. Now, Trump is resentful because he never was accepted in real high New York society, and all the other people are resentful because they don't have enough money and lost their job. But somehow all of this becomes the same. So, but there's a psychological mechanism that makes sense of that. So it seems to me you don't want to give up on the psychological mechanisms, because otherwise, I think Pascal's point that there wouldn't be any external validity seems to be a sensible objection.
Yeah. So I forget if it was Milgram or Zimbardo at one point notes that what's completely understudied on the basis of the experiments is why people who disobeyed. Right, all sorts of hypotheses about why you get a conformity effect, but no hypotheses, and maybe this is, there's a literature on this, and I just don't know it, certainly possible. No studies done of what leads, what's the profile, the psychological profile of people who resist, right? And that, in fact, I think would be the, apropos of Dan's hope for somehow culturally manipulating things. That's in fact what we should be looking at. What factors give people the ability to say no?
Thanks, Paul. I unfortunately will have to leave. I just wanted to say it was a great workshop. I learned a lot, and we should somehow do that again. I would have loved to be in Toulouse.
Next
year in Toulouse.
Yeah.
That sounds like a good idea.
Yeah. Think about it. Isabelle, you had a question?
Yes. Well, I have remarks and questions. The remark is about how easy it is to get people to kill each other, especially neighbors. And I tend to disagree, because books like Samantha Power's are a little bit misleading. It's actually very interesting to see that there were a lot of books about Bosnian War or Rwanda, which were called about neighbors at war, neighbors. Like if it was just, you wake up one morning and your neighbors come and kill you. Well, when you listen to stories quickly from afar, it looks like that. But I never saw anything like that in all the stories. There are a lot of steps between the time you were a good neighbor and the time when you kill each other. And for instance, there is one village where all the men and boys of the village were killed by the school teacher. Well, but when you listen to the people, there is one important step. One day, that guy put the military uniform, and become head of a company. So you always find that there is several institutional steps, like mobilization, like military mobilization, mobilization in a unit, all those kind of things. It's not, an outburst, and it always takes months. And there are also there are specific also contexts which have been underlined by many researchers. Generally, a need for very severe economic crisis before, so that people have a sense of real threat on their own existence. You will also find very often a sense of threat because you consider yourself as a victim of genocide, or victim of the war, like the Germans during the First World War and the Versailles treaties, or for the Serbs, a victim of a genocide before. So you need to be ready to fight. So there are steps, there are psychological steps, there are institutional steps. And even in Rwanda, what you find, it was very quick, but it was prepared by many episodes since the 60s, very violent episodes in the years before. It's just not an outburst which is immediate. So that's one point. And the second point is, I'm not sure, and I want to have more your opinion about that. Is it possible to, at the same time, you want to have an effect, and you say, well, I don't care about milligram. What interests me is the outcome, the effect. But if you want to have an effect, I think it's very difficult to just consider the psychology as a black box, because you have already lost the battle as compared to those who mobilize for bad reasons, because they know how to use passions, they know how to use certain emotions, the fear of to be a victim, the fear to lose, the sense that there's a threat on your existence, and if you want to prevent, I think you need to go in the psychology. So just to give you an example, I was giving you yesterday the difference between Srebrenica and Jepa. One of the reasons why there was no mass crime in Jepa, it's because there was a French military general who knew very well Mladic, and who knew what he was capable of, and that he was kind of a chess player who goes until you say no, until you stop him, he advances. And the kind of explanation that this general said that about, the fact that you always go farther can resonate with what Browning wrote about the utopia of genocide as a fantasy omnipotence. Well, that's partly what happened to Mladic, who took him for God. And there are many, so this general knew Mladic pretty well. He knew certain things about his way of working. And so what he did is he actually disobeyed orders. And he went alone with Shepa, with few men, and he opposed Mladic. So it's not the only reason, but he knew exactly the part he was supposed to play. So it's part of the reason. You need to find someone in front of you. You need to find at one point one opposition. So I'm wondering, Paul, how far you can go in saying, I want to have an effect, and leave the room of emotion, passions, motivations to people like Trump.
I don't want to leave anything to Trump. So I'm really going to upset you, and by telling you I don't really disagree with anything you said. Consider your own remarks. What was the difference? The school teacher put on a uniform one day and then could kill all his former students and their parents as well. Arendt, again, this is, part of the epigraph of the paper, she talks about this German sergeant, Anton Schmidt, who basically turned a blind eye, I guess, to some Polish Jews who he encountered fleeing and she said, just as a fact, why was he the exception rather than the rule? That's her question, right?
No, but it's in this situation, yes, but for instance, at the beginning of the war in Bosnia, it's a mix. It's a permanent mix.
Absolutely, but that's
you have the guy who you have in basically, and sometimes the same person was going to kill someone here and save another there. It was a permanent mix. So you have different situations, and I don't agree that just putting the uniform is just it's the institution of the army. It's fantasies. So you were saying, I do not understand those pictures. Well, there are also a whole habit in armies to have pictures of your trophies. It's it was in there is a whole culture and history where you photograph, you picture what you have done to show. So it doesn't entirely account for the psychology, but at least for the cultural rules in Wittgensteinian You have to follow a rule. And part of being in the army is also to brag about your, your deeds.
So, the uniform was your example. I mean, I don't know, yes, of course, you're right, that, there are steps. The question is what, how many, how do you get from being a school teacher to shooting your former students? That's, how many, what's that path? At any rate, as I said, I'm not, if we're disagreeing, I'm not clear where. As with Pascal, I'm my disagreement, if to the extent there is one, is I'm very focused on just the behavioral effect in our ability that I mean, generally a human ability to manipulate situations. We may not know precisely the variables, but yeah, you can play with them and you get the effect you want, and sufficient unto today to be able to do that. Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. There's always a finer grained story to be told, but at the end of the day, you're still left with the question of what gets people from one stage to the other. And you have these fortuitous interventions, such as the French general case you were mentioning, but right, that's just all they are. You have these isolated individuals who fortunately are on the scene and they make a difference, like Arendt's Anton Schmidt. But predicting that, understanding that in terms of someone's belief structure, I don't know. Again, if I thought understanding the belief structure was really going to have a good outcome, I'm there for it. I mean, but I just don't see the evidence.
John had a question, and then Stephen.
I wanted to riff a little bit on your theoretical quietism about Milgram. I like that Pascal reminded us of the story that Ned Jones dinged Milgram's paper the first time through. And of course, the rest of the story is Ned stepped down as the editor. The next editor said, "Are you crazy?" and called it back. And I guess if citations matter, we know which editor was right. But it strikes me, it made me laugh about Ned because, when we submit papers to psychology journals, the modal critical response is not enough theory. And everybody rolls their eyes because nobody reads the introduction and discussion section. They go right to the results, right? And when people write psychology papers, the stuff is usually done after the fact, the theory part, and you might be appalled, and it might be a lack of theoretical robustness is part of the problem with replication rates in psychology. Of course, there's no problem with replicating Milgram, but it strikes me, I'm not a historian of science, but it strikes me that it's a commonplace for there to be robust empirical results associated with, at best, inchoate and at worst, rankly false theory. This seems to happen all the time in medical science, psychotherapy, right? It may be that analysis helps some people. You don't have to buy into all Freud's hoo-ha to think that's the case. So it seems to me that we find this all the time. It's a different kind of criticism if the subjects didn't buy the cover story. I think it's pretty clear that Perry badly overstates that, but that's not a worry about theoretical infirmity, right? So the thought is, I take it your thought is it trust? Is it conformity? Is it obedience? I'm not really sure, but it seems like we do know there's a replicable result where people with less than fully coercive pressure, a good number of them do something that seems kind of horrible and was horrible by their own lights. And it doesn't seem to matter that the fact that nobody reads the second half of Milgram's book, right, doesn't seem to undermine that fact. So I would have thought that was a typical kind of thing in the history of science, and certainly conforms to my contemporaneous experience of how psychology gets produced. And I'm not saying there's no problems with it, but it doesn't seem like an empirical finding is undermined simply by noting theoretical infirmity.
I tell you that you know, that was just some observations. I mean, otherwise I'm just agreeing with everything you say, unless I've missed the dagger to my heart or something like that.
There wasn't no dagger. That was meant to be just a little bit of a closer grained on why someone might go for your quietism, right? And think there was something to be explained, even if Milgram's own theory is boring.
So yeah, the most frightening explanation is, we're hollow. It's like, we concoct all these post hoc rationalizations, and the sad truth is, we're blind to the factors that are moving us.
Just a comment. So I have the impression that you oscillate between two claims, that on one side you're skeptical or quietist about what's going on in our minds. On the second hand, you're like we are hollow and nihilist in a way, that there is nothing strong in you.
Well, that was just the deep side cynic in me coming out. I'm officially agnostic. I think Stephen.
Stephen had a question.
I'm just wondering how agnostic you are. I mean, I just want to say, well, I've learned so much from these discussions, this series of discussions. It's been terrific, especially towards the end. And I think the one thing I want to do is endorse what Isabel said about, I think it's an error that you make, Paul, in saying you don't care about the psychology, but just because situations can produce these outcomes and you don't care how. I don't think that can be right. I mean, and I wonder why you're just not interested in the sort of thing that Isabel raises, namely what it is that leads to, and it won't be just one thing, it'll be many different stories that enable the situations to produce these outcomes. And I think that in a way, this is very important work for the future. I mean, you yourself said we need an account of stability. I think we need something else too, which is raised in a book which I very much like. Nobody's referred to it in our discussions, by Abraham de Swan, called The Killing Compartments. I don't know.
Can you say that title again, please, Stephen?
It's called The Killing Compartments. It's by the sociologist Abraham de Swan, Dutch sociologist, very fine. And it's about the question of, it's not about stability, but it's about how under extreme conditions, and he talks about the Holocaust and also the massacres by the Belgians and many other cases. He discusses a whole series of cases and talks about the ways in which people can compartmentalize their attitudes and beliefs and find loving fathers at the same time engage in killing in the field and all that. I mean, you get that in Browning as well. How this is possible, what is it that prevents this compartmentalization? That's his, and he talks about de-individuation, this idea which has been raised about groupthink. And I also wondered, actually, in relation to what Pascal was saying, I mean, how does this all relate to what he cites Hugo Mercier from emphasizing, this idea how we're all epistemically vigilant. I mean, all these questions are questions that you could say are psychological questions. I don't. It seems to me you go in a inappropriately pessimistic direction in saying, look how easy it is. Look at the history of lynching, and we're all very extremely disturbed about Trump and the survival of Trumpism. And that's our moment right now. But really, I think we need to focus on what Isabel said. We need to focus on what's going on in people's minds that enables this to happen. I don't think you can just say you don't care. That's all.
Yeah, well, I was obviously being unduly flip, but and I do care a great deal. It's just I feel frustrated by trying to understand what, in fact, accounts for highly educated people, flocking to Trump and enabling him, and so forth. As I say, it's less about Trump, the person, than
Trumpism.
the ability of people like that to rally enablers to his cause. And I guess in a more serious moment, I've always been very taken by, and again, I forget if this came from Milgram or Sabardo, but I read it, in an interview transcript with one of them, where they and I think that two of them went to high school together, and it's an interesting fact about them, say New York City High School. They acknowledge, what's understudied or not studied at all is how you elicit, as it were, disobedience. What makes for the French general? What makes for that personality? Right, and I guess if I was going to get behind Dan Little's re-education drive, that's what I would like to. Right. Of course, there's the danger in cultivating too much resistance, but right, to try and understand what gives people the internal fortitude or whatever it is to resist certain social pressures. That's my more considered opinion. I'm just, as I look around the world, and literally the world, right? Not just Europe, not just America, but the world.
Right.
And how easily, you can mobilize, you don't need everybody, 30-40% works just fine, thank you. The numbers are what they are, and that's the problem for us.
Right.
So I have a train to catch, so I need to make someone host, so that the conversation can keep going without me, because I don't want to get. There are two more questions, and so is it okay, Nigel, for you?
I can do that,
Okay.
but it will. I'll do it in about 1 minute after I've come back from the toilet.
Okay.
I will use this minute to thank Raphael, because before he takes his train, and also to say that Raphael succeeded to gather the best historians and the best philosophers on those issues. But I have one regret: he did not gather them at the same time. So there were sessions with Stephen and Paul, and sessions with Browning several times, but not today. So what we really should do is try to put the philosophers and the historian together.
Right.
I did it once and there on the issues I was working on, but it's pretty rare. And I think it's really something that we have to work on.
Yeah, that's very true. I think it's problem, sociological problem of academics, that everyone needs to be with his peers, but not with the others, and it's a pity. But then next time, if we have to think
In Toulouse.
yeah, in Toulouse, exactly. In Toulouse.
Well, thanks, Raphael. A
Thank
lot.
you, everyone. For,
Yes, thank
I will make Nigel because I don't want. I find the discussion very great, and I don't want. But how do I do that? Yeah. Plus, so matter. So yeah. So now I'm not the host anymore. And so thank you all for participating, for the great talks and the great discussions. And I really also enjoy a lot the American or the American academic culture, because there is so much generosity in the way you practice conferences, because every time you try to be positive and to say something, and really something that I love, and it's model, and I am glad also that French people do that, and I wish we were more like you in the academic culture in France. So thank you all for.
Well, thank you very much for us.
I know you too. So,
Thank you.
and Pascal, you're in the same culture, but I think it's not. I think the American people, they have a kind of academic, they have a generosity, and that we learn from them in the way they behave in the conferences. So yeah.
You did a great job.
Bye. And hopefully we see you next time in real life, and maybe in Toulouse. I will try to think about something.
Thank you, Raphael.
Thank you.
Bye.
Paul, could I just make a quick comment? Well,
Go, Dan.
we're-
Yeah,
okay, good, thank you. You're back. Hi, Nigel.
I'm here. Yeah.
Am I cutting the queue though?
Sorry.
Am I cutting the queue?
No,
Or
that's
is it-
fine. That's fine. I mean,
Okay.
this is all extracurricular anyway.
It's
Okay.
tagged by name, so you can do that.
Well, Paul, I'll be kind of brief. I put a number of comments in the chat, and so that kind of caught the essence, but I've got two brief comments I wanted to make. One is, I think, latent assumption. I think you're making it, but I think the social psychology experiments that you're describing and that we've all been discussing also make the assumption that human behavior is unchanging and fundamentally unaffected by culture. And I think, frankly, that's a ridiculous assumption. And it's also the counsel of despair. Because if we cannot change our behavior through culture and new moral ideas and new understandings of how people can be anti-racist and not anti-Semitic and not, if we can't learn those things, then we are doomed. We are doomed. So that's observation number one. Social psychology, we have to understand, it's one reason why I'm not that persuaded by these two experiments we've been spending so much time talking about, because they are, undergraduate students from a particular time and place at Yale and Stanford, and they're all of the kind of cultural baggage that comes along with that. That's observation number one. Observation number two, I have children who are now 40. They were kids in K through 12 in the 1990s, and their education and the education of their peers fundamentally changed the way that young people think about race in America. I think that we can be very proud. Now, it doesn't mean, we've got a huge struggle in front of us because white supremacy is on the rise, but we also have a generation of people, almost two generations of people, who are anti-racist and who understand Dr. Martin Luther King and who understand the terror and horror of lynching in our history. The changes which have occurred in K through 12 education on the teaching of diversity and inclusion are really important changes. And that's why people are going after critical race theory, frankly. They're, the white supremacists are quite right. Any kind of critical discussion of race is very harmful for them because it does help children and young people and college students see more clearly, I do not want to be a racist. I do not want to support racist outcomes. I do not want to support racist organizations. So those are my two observations.
All right, well, let me just say, I'll just flat out deny that I make the sort of fundamentalist assumption about human nature that you suggest. I don't, I'm quite willing to accept the malleability of people. You know, the question is what sort of time frame you're working with to affect changes. Secondly, yeah, you know, I hope you're right. Frankly, I do. I mean, one of my, you know, my characteristic fashion, I say half jokingly, half seriously. You know, people say, well, you know, Biden won the election. I keep saying 70 million people voted for Trump. And you know, I'll add, you know, people can argue about tax policy. They can argue about, you know, various things. But you know, when you can't stand up and say, as Trump couldn't, that racism is wrong, right? After Charlottesville, just flat out dodged it, and you know, you have major news outlets promulgating, right, the you know, who would have thought, right, the replacement theory in 2020? You know, you got to be kidding me, right? So yeah, you know, I guess it's just a temperamental difference between a stand. I'm more of a glass half empty sort of guy. You know, I hope you're right. I hope I'm wrong. You know, but it's, you know, the wheels move slowly. The wheels move slowly. So you know, I'm sorry, it's very personal, not very philosophical, but it's how I see it.
Thank you, Paul.
Officer, hello. Would you like to ask your question?
Sure. I'll take it in a more really philosophical philosophy of science direction. Paul, you seem to assume two symmetries there. One is the symmetry between commission and omission. That is, you ask, why do we need to explain why people commit murder? Why shouldn't we try to explain why they refrain from committing it in some rare historical periods, presumably usually between economic recessions? And secondly, the symmetry between the explanandum and the comparison conditions. That is, usually in historiography, when we ask, let's say, why Gutenberg invented printing, then the other part of it is we make a comparison. Is why Gutenberg invented printing when he did, rather than 100 years earlier, or why was printing invented in Germany rather than in Italy, that was the center of culture. And then people ask why ordinary people killed their neighbors rather than refrain from killing them. Then you reverse, where it's just the same way as asking why they refrain from killing them rather than killing them. And in so much of history, neighbors raided and killed and murdered and raped each other. Now, the classical debate about that was that the choice of the explanandum is value-laden in one way or another. That is, the kind of questions that we ask, even though they are all could be fair enough, why we choose this or that comparison situation depends on our values or our practical interests or on pragmatic concerns and so on. The distinction between omission and commission actually is much more interesting, because in the literature about causation, people seem to assume they know what omission is and what commission is, and you kind of question the distinction, it seems to me.
Yeah, so yeah, I certainly did raise the question of, you know, whether it's stability or, what's sort of the default and what we should be surprised at and what we should be studying. But yeah, the omission commission distinction, I mean, that's just a quibble. I mean, the question you raised is genuine enough. The way I've always understood the admission commission distinction is where you do something like shoot someone, as opposed to, say, just standing by and letting them drown. That's a sin of omission, as opposed to a sin of commission. But that's not central to what you were asking. But yeah, where did you want to go? Where did you want to go with that that point, Avi.
The question is there a fact of the matter that you are debating, or is it just a matter that we're questioning different values? Is it that a value, we just assume that human beings are decent except when there's an issue?
Yeah, that's right.
Or do we just assume that human beings are murderous rats, and only when they are extremely well fed and tired, they are refraining from eating each other?
I don't think. I mean, you're certainly in the right ballpark. I don't accept, the particular either or as you posed it, but I the issue is, what makes for stability of behavior and what induces change, right? And I think people take too much for granted, that stability of behavior represents internal fortitude or something like that. I'm skeptical. I think this point goes back to Durkheim, certainly, right? You change someone's social circumstances, you see some, dramatic changes in behavior, and it's that relationship, I think, that should be more studied than it is. That we shouldn't be that there's a false confidence, as it were, in just how stable our institutional or whether the stability of our institutions can be ascribed to the stability of a set of beliefs. That's where I'm deeply skeptical. Does that address your question?
Well, I was trying to move in a more philosophy of science direction. Is it the division between comparison situation and the explanandum? Is that value laden, or is that effect of the matter, or is just entirely symmetrical? So asking why people murder under certain conditions is just the same as why they don't murder under certain.
Right. Well, Weber's, of course, your choice of questions is always value laden. That I take as a given.
Okay, I think we've come to the end of the questioning process, suitably extended. Paul, I think it was very fitting that we ended this this marvelous session that we've had today and yesterday, and the the 3 that preceded it last year. So thanks ever so much for revisiting your paper, which I checked a couple of hours ago to see that quite justly it's received a lot more citations than mine in the same issue. And I didn't ask a question of your presentation just now, but I found really stimulating and congenial, if that's the right word, those skeptical questions on moral luck, robustness and stability with which you ended. I've been doing an undergraduate course on the Holocaust and genocide here at Exeter for about 20 years. And I begin with reflections on the truism that we must learn from the Holocaust. And I mean, the aim of the whole course is to get students to really think about what that could mean, what that could entail, because I think it's too easy to think you've learned something profound and significant, and that can be almost worse than thinking you've learned nothing. So I find very congenial, and so I mean it's the kind of thing that I seek to get young minds to at least consider, regardless of where they end up. So thanks ever so much for that. I really appreciated it. Thanks to everybody else for their really sharp questions. And it would be great if we could all meet next time, perhaps in person. I really hope so. But I now, as it were, with this Speech Act, declare this meeting closed. And thanks, everybody.
My thanks to everyone for their discussion.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See you. Bye.